The office was still celebrating when the company's biggest client called with one terrifying question: "Where is he?" Nobody answered. The woman who had proudly fired him only hours earlier suddenly stopped smiling. She looked around the conference room, expecting someone else to speak, but the silence became heavier with every second. Then the CEO slowly closed the folder in front of him and asked again, "Where is Daniel?" Only then did everyone realize that the quiet single father they had treated like a disposable employee was the one person holding together the company's most important account. Before we continue, if you believe everyone deserves kindness, dignity, and a second chance, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this story, and subscribe to Kindness Corner. Your support helps us bring more stories about compassion, courage, and second chances. Daniel Carter had never been the loudest person in the office. He arrived before sunrise, usually carrying a worn black backpack, a small lunch container, and the tired expression of a man who had learned to keep moving no matter how exhausted he felt. He was a single father raising his 8-year-old daughter, Lily, after her mother had left their lives several years earlier. Every morning, Daniel dropped Lily at school before taking 2 buses across town to reach the corporate office where he worked as a client support specialist. He wasn't wealthy. His apartment was small, his car had stopped working months ago, and sometimes he quietly skipped lunch so he could make sure Lily had enough groceries at home. But Daniel never complained. He believed that if his daughter saw him giving up, she might someday believe that difficult circumstances were a reason to stop trying. So he kept showing up. At the office, however, not everyone respected him. His supervisor, Vanessa Reed, considered Daniel weak because he rarely argued with anyone. She didn't know that Daniel's silence came from years of choosing his battles carefully. Vanessa noticed his old clothes, his inexpensive shoes, and the fact that he sometimes had to leave exactly on time to pick up his daughter. She interpreted all of that as a lack of ambition. Then one Monday morning, everything changed. The company's largest client, a nationwide retail corporation, suddenly reported a major technical problem affecting hundreds of stores. If the issue wasn't solved quickly, the company could lose the contract, costing millions of dollars and potentially dozens of jobs. Panic spread through the office. Managers held emergency meetings, engineers searched for answers, and executives demanded immediate results. Daniel was the one who discovered what was wrong. He stayed at his desk long after everyone else had gone home. He reviewed thousands of records and noticed a tiny pattern that others had missed. By midnight, he had identified the problem. By 2 a.m, he had created a temporary solution. He sent everything to Vanessa before leaving the office, hoping she would pass it to the technical team. But Vanessa saw an opportunity. The next morning, she presented Daniel's discovery to senior management as if her department had solved the crisis. She received praise from executives while Daniel sat silently in the back of the room. Then, unexpectedly, the client asked to speak directly with the employee who had discovered the issue. Vanessa knew exactly who they wanted. Daniel. But instead of admitting the truth, she told the executives that Daniel had violated company procedure by working outside his assigned hours and accessing files without authorization. She claimed he had created unnecessary risks for the company. By afternoon, Daniel was called into a conference room. He stood there holding his worn backpack while Vanessa placed a termination letter on the table. She told him his employment was ending immediately. Daniel didn't argue. He simply looked at the paper, then quietly asked if he could collect his daughter's school pickup reminder from his desk. Vanessa smiled coldly and told him that wouldn't be necessary. Daniel walked out carrying only his backpack. As the elevator doors closed behind him, he took a deep breath and looked at his phone. There was a message from Lily asking if he could still make pancakes for dinner. Daniel stared at the screen for several seconds before typing, "Of course, sweetheart." He didn't tell her he had been fired. That evening, he stood in their tiny kitchen making pancakes while quietly calculating how long their savings could last. Lily sat at the table doing homework, unaware that her father was trying not to cry. Daniel had spent his entire life believing that hard work would eventually open a door. For the first time, he wondered what happened when every door seemed to close at once. The next morning, Vanessa arrived at work feeling victorious. She told co-workers that Daniel had been a liability and that removing him had been the best decision for the department. She even joked that the company would finally be able to move forward without someone who couldn't keep up. Then the CEO arrived. His name was Richard Hayes, and unlike Vanessa, he knew the company's operations in detail. He entered the executive conference room expecting an update on the client crisis. Instead, he found everyone celebrating the previous day's results. Richard looked at the reports. Something didn't make sense. The solution credited to Vanessa contained a technical explanation that wasn't written in her usual style. Richard had seen Daniel's work before. He recognized the structure immediately. He looked up and asked the room a simple question. "Where is Daniel?" The room went silent. Vanessa tried to explain that Daniel had been terminated for violating policy. Richard's expression changed. Terminated? He opened his laptop and contacted the client directly. Within minutes, the client's director joined the call and asked why Daniel wasn't present. He explained that Daniel had been the only employee who correctly identified the problem and that their company had specifically requested that he remain involved until the system was completely stabilized. Richard stared at Vanessa. Then he asked her to send him the original records. She hesitated. That hesitation was enough. Richard reviewed the files and discovered that Daniel's original work had been altered before being presented to management. He also found emails proving that Daniel had warned Vanessa about the issue before she claimed credit for solving it. The celebration ended instantly. Richard ordered an internal investigation. But Daniel wasn't sitting at home waiting for justice. He had already started applying for other jobs. He had no idea that the CEO was trying to find him. 3 days later, Daniel received a phone call. He almost didn't answer. When he did, Richard introduced himself and apologized. Daniel remained silent for a moment. Richard told him the truth: the company had failed him. His work had been stolen, his reputation had been damaged, and he had been fired because someone above him wanted credit for his success. Then Richard offered him his job back. But Daniel didn't immediately accept. He asked one question: what will be different this time? Richard paused before answering. Everything. He offered Daniel a new position, direct access to senior management, a salary increase, and most importantly, protection from the people who had treated him unfairly. Daniel eventually returned, not because he needed revenge, but because he wanted to prove something to Lily. That losing a job didn't mean losing your worth. Months later, Daniel was promoted to lead an entire client support division. He became known as one of the most trusted people in the company. But the biggest change wasn't his salary or title. It was what he did with his success. Daniel created a small employee assistance program for workers facing financial difficulties, childcare problems, or unexpected emergencies. He remembered what it felt like to be one missed paycheck away from fear. And Vanessa? She resigned before the investigation was completed. Years later, Daniel still kept the original termination letter in a drawer at home. Not because he wanted to remember the humiliation, but because it reminded him of something Lily once told him. One evening, after hearing the story, Lily looked at her father and said, "Dad, they thought you were nothing. But you knew you weren't." Daniel smiled and hugged her. "No," he whispered. "I just kept going until someone finally saw the truth." Sometimes the person being overlooked is the very person everyone needs. Sometimes kindness arrives too late to prevent the pain, but just in time to change what happens next. And sometimes the greatest victory isn't making the person who hurt you regret their decision. It's becoming the person they never believed you could become. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who needs encouragement, and subscribe to Kindness Corner. Every like, comment, and share helps these stories reach someone who may be quietly fighting a battle of their own. And before you leave, comment, "Keep going," if you believe that no setback can define a person's future. Because sometimes, the door that closes in your face isn't the end of your story. Sometimes, it's simply the beginning of the chapter where everyone finally discovers your worth.